Okay.
So it's like college and high school?
Yeah.
I was anticipating a change of behavior. Aaron, I would actually, I was exercising by walking each person's copy of the notes to them personally, but I'm done exercising. So if you would please exercise over here. Now these notes today, by the way, are for both, they kind of pulled together where I started on Friday, but got off track. And these notes are for today and Wednesday. After the class on Wednesday, I'll post the midterm. You'll have the whole weekend until next Tuesday at 11:55 p.m. That's all clear? All right, good. I have to say that in my last semester of full-time college teaching, this is the first time I've ever taught this class and actually have stayed on schedule. So it just shows that those dogs can learn new tricks. So if you have your copies of Leviathan in front of you, here's what I want to do. I want to actually, I do want to make a couple of general comments about his teachings by framing it. And then we talked a little bit about the stuff under Roman numeral 2, which is a part of part 1, human psychology, but we still have a few points to make about that. Then what I want to do is finish part 1 with you, which if you're following on the notes, this means not only seeing what a human being is, you've actually seen the elements of it, but we do need to look especially at his definition of passion, because you're going to see Hobbes' understanding of passion is what constitutes you and me. You and I are our passions. Now what that means and the implications of that we'll see. And then it's critical for us to see his understanding of speech and the natural status of speech, because this leads to one of the great issues that we've already seen to some degree implicit in Machiavelli and Descartes, and will become an abiding theme throughout the rest of the course. If I may risk being repetitive, here is that question. We are part of the universe, right? You may not feel that at this point in the morning at 10 o'clock on Monday, but you are. Take my word for it, you are part of the universe. Therefore, isn't it clear that we participate in the same nature of reality as the universe?
Yes.
Well, in a way it's obvious, isn't it? But here's what's not so obvious, and you're going to see this is the big difference between Aristotle, Plato, the Bible, all antiquity that we've already seen, and the thought that is emerging in front of us. The question is are we in some ways fundamentally different from the rest of the universe? That's the question that you're going to see. Now, to beginning with Machiavelli and Descartes, and you'll see in Hobbes, etc., the answer to that is no. We are not fundamentally different from the rest of the universe. But yet it's clear from just the human experience that you and I have in this life that somehow we're different. All of these thinkers argue that we are not really different, but we are different. Okay, then do you understand where this question goes? The question is, what's the status of that difference then? I introduced this term to you, I think, a couple of weeks ago, or a couple of sessions ago, but it's worth reminding you of it right now. It's a fancy word, but it describes what they're trying to get at. Epiphenomenal. The word epiphenomenal. Phenomenal comes from the Greek word phainein, which means to appear to be on the surface. That's why a phenomenon, I know you think Dr. Gunn is a phenomenon, and Dr. Gunn is a phenomenon. But literally, when something is phenomenal, it means in appearance. Epiphenomenal is actually something of a redundancy. The word epi is the Greek word for on top of, or on the surface of. So literally, something that's epiphenomenal means something that exists only on the surface of reality. So as you're going to see, I mean, Hobbes's politics and his political science is first and foremost a reformulation of human psychology. And that's why we'll have to talk a little bit about Aristotle and what he's doing in part 1. But what I want to then do with the rest of today and then Wednesday is lead you through the rest of his teaching. And that means see what the use in the natural status of speech and reason is. Now, by the way, interestingly enough, both Aristotle and Hobbes would say what makes us different from the rest of animals, at least, is our use of reason and speech. But the difference between Aristotle and Hobbes is for Aristotle, speech isn't epiphenomenal. It's indicative that there's a new natural distinction, a new natural power going on in human life that makes us different from the rest of creation. And by the way, you're going to see, this is also what the source of our freedom and responsibility is. How many of you think you should be held responsible for your actions? Okay. Now you understand, this only makes sense if there's some kind of essential freedom in you. You cannot hold an unfree being responsible for its actions. So on one level, you're going to see, there's a reason when we get to Nietzsche that Nietzsche's going to suggest that all modern criminality will eventually be a science of medicine. And that the idea that you, but again, the problem is can you really live life without assuming that you're free? I'm not talking about freedom in the sense of like free to give, you know, to give doctors on the finger. Of course, we're not free to do that. Although I often sit there in my office on the other side of the wall going. But how many of you think you have some kind of genuine freedom? Well, again, you could say, well, what does that even mean? Well, we'll be puzzling this out because most of the great thinkers that we'll be seeing, including Hobbes, deny that there is any essential or real freedom to human life. So yeah. And
I think people often confuse the freedom of choice with the freedom from consequence. Like, you can technically do something. I can technically drop out of school. That doesn't mean that I won't have consequences for that.
yeah, it's not I understand, because you could say this, that I love the cat who is not my cat, Frozen. And like if she jumps on the counter, I'll say things like, bad cat. Now you could say, and that'll get her to jump up, because why, and then she jumps off the counter. Why does she jump off the counter?
She can tell that you're angry and she likely wants to avoid any kind of like serious repercussions from that. Like animals can sense anger.
Well, by the way, you're going to see animals can sense cause and effect, Hobbes says, but not fully. So as you're going to see, part of what's unfolding in the Leviathan is what is human consciousness? And there's no question it's bound up with this thing called reason and speech. But the difference between Aristotle and Plato is Hobbes does not think the difference, rational consciousness and speech and words, is a natural distinction. So that means, in other words, as you're going to see with him and with all these subsequent thinkers, reason and speech is artificial. It is acquired, invented and acquired by human beings, and becomes a kind of an overlay on our nature. It makes us think that we're different from the rest of the universe. But part of what Hobbes is doing, I think, as is the previous thinkers we've read, and the subsequent ones, is they are deconstructing this sense that human beings are somehow unique from and better than the rest of the universe. It's a kind of a deconstruction or a puncturing of human pride. Well, let's again start moving to this stuff. Here's this was from Friday's notes, but I just didn't get to it, and it is still kind of an introduction, and it has to do with the structure of the Leviathan. I get, well, you're back to the introduction. Yes, I'm back to the introduction. All right, so what? There are 4 parts to the Leviathan. Tabitha, part 1. Nathalie, part 2. Stephen, part 3, and Aaron, part 4. I would get up and bring this to you, Sierra, because that was my version of exercise. But I'm done with exercising for the day. Did you know that Dr. Dunn told me that before he retires, his primary goal is to make sure there's an elevator in this building? Couldn't he have started this like 40 years ago? Anyway, so I made the comment that I think Leviathan is the most important book published in the last 500 years. By the time this discussion is done on Wednesday, today and Wednesday, I hope to make that thesis evident to you. And on Friday, the way I was trying to prosecute that thesis to you was by suggesting if you looked at the 2 things that made, if I were to take any of you and drop you 500 years ago anywhere on Earth, your life would be remarkably different than it is today. Now, one sense is the technology that they carved, and Bacon and Hobbes and Locke. But the other way that your life would be different, after all, most of you, with the exception of the bearded guy sitting across from me, are of the female persuasion. Do you not think that your life as a woman, however you define that, is profoundly different than it was 500 years ago, wherever you go across the earth? And you know what? You're going to see Hobbes is the first modern feminist. Because what I want to do either today or Wednesday, depending when we get to this, I want to read to you from the passage in chapter 20, which actually is the beginning of modern feminism. And you're going to see what that means is, not just your status as women, but our status as non-aristocratic, regular peon human beings. The doctrines that Hobbes is unleashing in this book, especially in chapters 13 and 14, completely revolutionized what it means to be a human being in this world. And you and I are the beneficiaries of this remarkable change. So it isn't just the technological environment unleashed by the authors that we're reading. It's the political environment, the political and social environment. Look, in 1990 I spent 7 weeks in India on a group Fulbright studying the changing role of women and family in Indian society. And one might say this, that everywhere you went, the change between the way that women used to live or still do live in India, because by the way, this is the dark secret about India. You know what sati is? In one of the Indian religious epics, the Ramayana, it's a story of how the god Rama and his wife Sita, she is abducted by the demon Ravana, who actually, his kingdom was in Sri Lanka, the island of Sri Lanka. And so the story of the Ramayana as an epic is how Rama, the god Rama, enlists the aid of all the other gods, including Hanuman, the monkey god. It's interesting, by the way, because all the Indian students were, because we spent 3 weeks at Madras University, now the University of Chennai, and they were having their final exams when we were there. And all of the students, the Hindu students, would pray to the monkey god Hanuman, before their exams. Now, I'm sure that some of you pray to God before your exams, but you probably don't think you're praying to a monkey god, unless you go to my door, where I put up the picture of Dr. Dunn, and you'll see that was, you'll see his prehensile tail. So here's the story of the epic. Sita, so the demon Ravana abducts her. But Rama, by the way, and the other gods succeed in rescuing her. But, and Ravana never touched her, never raped her, never sullied her. But to prove that to Rama that she was pure, she immersed herself and burned herself to death to prove that she was pure. Almost kind of like Lucretia. Now, in mercy, Rama resurrected her. But the point is so the word for truth in Sanskrit is sati, and when a husband dies, in many parts of India, this is the dark secret, guess what they do? They throw the widow onto the funeral pyre and immolate her along with it. So on one level, my point here is you could actually go, and here's a country, India, which is in the middle of modernization. You could say all nations are in the process of modernization according to the spread of the song. We could actually see the spread of these concepts changing the way that people live their lives. And so on one level, that's how I would argue that science of Descartes and Hobbes, and Bacon for that matter, provide the technological change in the nature of our existence. But it's the conceptual foundations that you are reading in this book that lead to the political and social transformation that is still ongoing in humanity and still unfolds in ways that nobody can yet see. So, to go back to the 4 parts of Leviathan. Why are there 4 parts to Leviathan? The first 2 parts, which I've asked you to read, this is the only time since I've been teaching this work that I didn't ask you to read parts 3 and 4, but I'll talk about them so you know why they're there. They both they both reflect and refute Aristotle's political and ethical teaching. If you've had ancient political philosophy, Aristotle's political teaching is contained in two books, one called the Ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, and the other one is called the Politics. At the beginning of the Ethics, and so by the way, this is actually referring to, in the notes, to Roman numeral 1a, 1 and 2. Aristotle says, this is my science of human life, and it consists of two parts. What constitutes individual goodness and happiness, that's the ethics, and what constitutes collective goodness and happiness, the politics. But he does say at the beginning of the ethics, this is the first part of a two-part work called the politics. So the ethics deals with the individual human being. Now what does it mean to say to deal with the individual? What kind of stuff does Aristotle talk about in the ethics? He talks about, it's his psychology, by the way. Because in it, he lays out the parts of the soul, the rational, the irrational parts of the soul, and in it, you'll see that Aristotle says that the purpose of human life is happiness. Now, you may or may not remember this discussion, Aaron, from, 300 years ago?
Sorry?
You may or may not remember this discussion from ancient political philosophy 300 years ago. How many of you think that human life has a purpose?
If you give it one.
Well, by the way, I mean, that, as you're going to see, that's our modern understanding, but Aristotle says, no, human life has a purpose. It's happiness. How does he know that? How many of you have ever tried to do something? So you had a purpose in mind, right? How many of you say want money, honor, a nice job, a happy marital relationship, children, obedient children, quiet and obedient children. Okay, sex, love, whatever. Aristotle would say, okay, people want different things. That's an obvious fact, isn't it? But why do you want money? Because you think it will do what? Why do you want love? Why do you want children? Yeah. So his point is, if you follow the train of causality that guides human actions, what does every human action eventually lead back to?
Happiness.
And therefore Aristotle says, now you could say, but everybody has a different understanding of happiness, as is revealed in the Broadway musical, You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. Happiness is 2 kinds of ice cream. So now you know what happiness is. 2 kinds of ice cream. Anyway, so what Aristotle says is what real happiness is completing the end or completion of human life, which is rational self-rule through virtue. So the point is, and Aristotle says, since all things have an end, the universe has an end or a purpose, what he calls in Latin, by the way, the summum bonum. How many of you had Latin? What's summum bonum? What's bonum? Bona. In Latin, bueno, or in Spanish, bueno. Good. So summum bonum means the highest good, the final end of all existence. You're going to see Aristotle comes right and says, there's no such thing as a summum bonum. There's no such thing as a final end or purpose. In fact, you'll see the critical statement where he completely wipes away Aristotle's psychology. So, that's why Aristotle's philosophy is often called teleological. The word, you might want to write this down, T-E-L-O-S. T-E-L-O-S. Telos is the Greek word for, first of all, its most obvious meaning is target, like what you aim an arrow at. But it's the generic Greek word for purpose or end. And so Aristotle not only argues that there is a purpose to existence, but there's a purpose and an end, a completion to human life. And that's why his philosophy is called teleological. It means that his study of nature, his view of nature, is that nature moves towards an end or a perfection or purpose. And that means we have a perfection and an end and a purpose. So you can say, Aristotle can say, you can know rationally, given human nature, that what humans want, they want to be happy, and if you study human nature, you can actually tell what the purpose and end of human life is. Now, in Roman numeral 1a2, the second part of this great work, so by the way, what he does in the ethics, he takes you through all different kinds of virtue, like moderation, courage, justice, prudence, and then ultimately friendship, and then in part 2 of his politics, called the politics, then he expands to what collective human happiness and goodness is. And this is critical, you're gonna see when we turn to part 2 of Leviathan. In studying politics, when I teach American government, when I try to explain what the regime is, and I make an analogy to psychology. If psychology is the study of the person, psychology studies persons by the theories of personality. That is to say, whether you're Freudian or Jungian or Platonist, or you're, whether you do Gestalt therapy or whatever kind of psychology. So, by the way, the only difference is if you're a Skinnerian. Now, some of you had psychology, haven't you? So, you know, Skinner, like Hobbes, by the way, so if you want to see what Skinner's psychology is, you're encountering in this book. How many of you ever, so you had a class in, what's Skinner known for? B.F. Skinner. Yeah, and what does he mean by that, as opposed to misbehaviorism? What's behaviorism?
Essentially that learning is just understanding causes and effects, like that you do something and you get either a reward or a punishment for it.
Yeah, what's he, you've ever heard what a Skinner box is? What's a Skinner box?
The rats.
Yeah, the rat with the pedal.
They have them. Third floor coon. You go look at them.
I know, it's called faculty meetings.
Well, I know the code to get in.
And by the way, the same concept is represented in Pavlov's dog. Who is Pavlov? And what was Pavlov's dog? Why is that? What do you know about that? Well,
classical conditioning.
And that's what Skinner is, by the way, because he had his dog. And remember, the Pavlov trained his dog so that when he heard a bell and we feed him, and the dog would salivate. Today it's called changing the channel. So on one level, you're going to see that's all right in Hobbes. Hobbes says all we are just. Skinner technically argues that all learning is operant conditioning, and is either approach avoidance. In other words, animals, and you see this is right out of the Leviathan, animals know 2 experiences, pain and pleasure. And if you've ever taken a knitting needle and like heated it to red hot, and then applied it to the rear end of a dog.
Quick question, are you speaking from experience on this?
That sounds like animal abuse.
I'm just trying
Sounds
to
like a
keep you
felony
awake at
offense.
10 o'clock in the morning on a Monday. What will the dog do?
John?
Call 911. Well, because what's it avoiding?
Around trying
Pain. And when a dog sees delicious home-baked food, so approach avoidance simply means wanting pleasure and avoiding pain. That is the whole of human psychology right there, according to Hobbes in this book. So Hobbes is really the foundation of Pavlovian or Skinnerian psychology. Now again, I've had this conversation many times with my friends in the psych department, especially Dr. Keene, who claims to be a Skinnerian. And yet, my argument would be, Skinner talks a big game. You can't actually raise human beings according to Skinnerian psychology. You need things like love and guidance and morality. So it turns out that we are more than animals, but that's an editorial comment. At any rate, Hobbes, to go finish Aristotle, so you see what Hobbes is doing. Aristotle then argues, because that's how I got off on psychology. So different theories of personality. Again, if you're Freudian, what are the elements of personality?
Your sexual attraction to your dog.
And if you had met my mother,
That's the answer you're looking for.
and we call what part of the personality is that?
That is the id.
The id. And what's at the top telling you shouldn't want to have sex with your mother?
Your superego.
Your superego. I know, that reminds you of Dr. Dunn. You think, there's a perfect example of a superego. And then your pitiful ego in the middle trying to articulate the claims between your internalized parental morality and societal morality and your, okay, fine. So, in the same way, Aristotle says politics and the human community can be arranged by types. What he calls, those types are called constitutions or regimes. And Aristotle, now this is really critical, as you're going to see, because Hobbes is going to directly reject this. Aristotle says there are 6 kinds of personalities, political personalities, constitutions, or regimes. How does he get 6? It's 2 times 3. Am I right about that?
Yes.
Good. Hobbes says that math is the only truth, so, alright. So, 2 times 3, 3 times what? What's the 3? The number of beings that can be ruling in a community. And what are the possibilities? 1, few, many. Does that make sense? Now the other possibility, where does the 2 come from? Aristotle says, regimes can be classified not only by the number of people ruling, but whether they're just or unjust. Just meaning ruling for the common good, unjust means ruling in their own interest. So what are the 6 fundamental kinds of political classifications for Aristotle? Well, here, we can do this actually. So if you have just and unjust, and 1, few, and many, I know this. Here, I'll have to walk all the way over here. As long as I'm over here, why don't I just do it on this board over here? Okay. You can stop talking to yourself now because the students are going to start wondering how many of you are in there. Just and unjust, and number. 1, few, many. The rule of 1 for the common good or just is called kingship. The rule of the few best for the common good is called aristocracy. The rule of the many for the common good is called polity, because it's the rule of law. And by the way, for Aristotle, this is the best, and it goes down this way. So this is the best of the best, the middle of the best, and the worst of the best. And on the unjust side, the least bad, the next least bad, and the worst. So what's the unjust rule of the many for their own good? Democracy. So for Aristotle, democracy is an unjust form of government because you have the many, the mob, ruling in their own good. Oligarchy, the rule of the wealthy few for their own good. The rich get rich and the poor get poorer. It is oligarchy. Now, by the way, Aristotle, if he were alive today and looked at most of human history, would say, you had, like from Charlemagne on until Napoleon, Europe was ruled by Christian aristocracy, and which were ruled by, and by the way, almost all regimes across the world were aristocratic regimes. China, India, Aztecs, Mayans, everyone. So what's the premise of an aristocracy? That some people are better than others and entitled to rule, right? By the way, you're going to see Hobbes will demolish that idea in chapter 13. Because the critical doctrine about human nature that comes out in chapter 13 is all human beings are equal. So, but at any rate, for Aristotle, the rule of the wealthy few, and Aristotle would have said most of the aristocracies in history were actually oligarchies. Do you think that the Roman Senate were better human beings than the plebeians? Do you think that the British aristocracy, how many of you know the history plays of Shakespeare?
A little.
I mean, do you think those aristocrats were better human beings than the people that they thought they were better than? I mean, the War of the Roses, they're monsters. So, and then of course, what's the worst of all possible regimes? The rule of the one for his or her own benefit? Tyranny. Now, the reason that's important is you're going to see at the beginning of part 2, when Hobbes begins to lay out his political teaching, he says, that's baloney. There are only 3 kinds of constitutions or regimes. 1, few, and many. And so what's the definition of tyranny or oligarchy or democracy? He says, yeah, I probably
Broke
broke
the
it.
marker. What did you do?
I don't know.
It's not still but not one open either.
I didn't read the printed instructions.
Obviously.
So he says, all tyranny is monarchy misliked. Now you're going to see, by the way, Hobbes is a first relativist too, because he's going to say that everybody makes his own judgment of good and bad, and there's no such thing as nature, by nature, as just and unjust. So there are only 3 kinds of constitution for Hobbes, and so, by the way, so that's how, I'm sorry, go ahead, Sierra.
I was just going to ask, what did the P stand for again?
Polity.
Oh.
For Aristotle, the least good of the good regimes is a mixture of, actually a blending of 2 of the bad regimes. Oligarchy, the rule of the wealthy, and democracy, the rule of the mob, of the many, equal. And by the way, if Aristotle were alive today, he would say that America is a polity. We have a constitution. Are there wealthy people in America?
Yes.
But yet, isn't it true that still to get to office you have to have the people's vote?
Kind of.
So Aristotle said we're a blending, America's a blending of oligarchy and democracy under a constitution. That seems pretty accurate, doesn't it? At any rate. So you're going to see that, so Aristotle, Hobbes because remember, just like Descartes is dethroning the scholasticism of the universities of his day, and you'll see at the end of the Leviathan, in the letter of the review and conclusion, Hobbes clearly wants his book to replace Aristotle as the textbook in the universities. And for your information, that's how Hobbes thinks. The ideas in his head, in his book, are going to actually spread. It's a kind of, you'll see the letter of review and conclusion is literally a plan for reforming humanity through a kind of a trickle-down formula, starting with the universities. So he has to imitate Aristotle in order to refute him, and we'll show how he does that. Now the other two parts of the Leviathan, part 3 on a Christian commonwealth, and parts 4, Kingdom of Darkness, I decided not to use in this semester to guarantee that I actually could finish the material. In this, by the way, so what Hobbes does in part 1 and 2 is present his natural teaching, the teaching that he believes you can know through science, reason, and observation. In parts 3 and 4, why are there a part 3 and 4 when there wasn't a part 3 and 4 to Aristotle? Because what didn't exist when Aristotle wrote? I know lots of things that refrigerators didn't exist. Electric cars didn't exist. What important religion founded by a Jewish guy in Israel 2,000 years ago didn't exist when Aristotle was writing? And you're going to see, that's why there has to be a part 3 and a 4. Because what kind of universe does Hobbes live in?
Pretty Christian.
A pretty Christian universe. And by the way, remember, Christianity is in the middle of a tremendous civil war at this time. And not only, by the way, what's the tremendous civil war in Christianity? And actually, Christianity had several civil wars. In the early 1300s, called the Great Schism, if you know Catholic history, what was that about? What's called the Great Schism by Catholicism?
Isn't that when the Orthodox Church broke off?
Right. Well, yes, when they refused to recognize the authority of Rome as the one true church. In Catholic history, that's called the Great Schism. So the Eastern Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox Church, those are called schismatic movements. Now I want you to know that Pope John Paul II has reconciled all this and said we're all Christians today. And by the way, in 1992 he actually said Luther was right. That was an amazing thing to admit, for a pope to admit. But if you read that statement, it's nice. He says, Luther was right, it's all justification by faith. But then in the next paragraph he says, there's still sacrament. Anyway, so as you're going to see, Hobbes in part 1 and 2, especially in part 2, is going to define the power of the sovereign is to decide every public question, including, by the way, the content of Christianity. So to finish the thought, so Christianity is in the middle of a big war right now. Not just the Great Schism of the 1300s, but what's the big civil war within Christianity in Europe?
The Reformation.
Yeah. So Protestantism and Catholicism. Now you're going to see, technically, the Kingdom of Darkness in part 4 is Catholicism. But you should also remember, Hobbes was in England in the 1650s, and English Protestantism was in the middle of a terrible civil war. And what was that civil war?
The Puritans and the...
Anglicans. Yeah, and Hobbes, by the way, was an Anglican. And I might have mentioned this in the historical background, but just to repeat it, there were actually two aspects to the English Civil War going on. One was religious and one was political. What was the political Civil War going on? Who had been queen and from 15? When did she start?
Elizabeth.
Yeah, she died in 16.
Oh, she's the one who died without an heir.
Right, and then who became king?
Charles the First.
His
James.
James I, who's actually king of Scotland.
The 6th of Scotland, the 5th of Scotland.
I think it was the 5th.
He had
of
a
Scotland.
different number, and then they changed his number.
I know. Well, you know, the British have trouble
I only know
counting up to
that.
Yes, so I think you're right. But they became King James I of England, and his son became King Charles I. Elizabeth, following Henry, was a tutor, and James and Charles were stewards, and they were absolutists, royal absolutists. In other words, they figured, and their idea, what was the foundation of the British Constitution? The authority of the crown. And what was the opposite?
The authority of the people.
The Parliament. So you could say that the twofold clash was between Anglicanism and Puritanism. And by the way, they temporarily won, the Puritans and the Republicans, by the way. In 1641, they deposed Charles I, and then in 1649, they beheaded him. And who became the ruler of England? The Protector, the Lord Protector. And England was technically a republic then, from 1641 to 1656, called Protectorate. But it was, we forget that, and then in 1656, Charles II was restored as king. Now, of course, it turns out that Anglicanism won in England, although following Locke, Anglicanism became tolerant, because Locke, we're not reading this in this class, but Locke wrote an important letter called the Letter on Toleration, in which he advocates the radical concept of the separation of church and state. Now, you understand that from from Elizabeth up until 1688, Catholicism was actually an illegal religion in England. And so you're going to see that the separation of church and state that comes out of these doctrines actually made Catholicism and ultimately other religions legal in England. So Hobbes has to include parts of his teaching that weren't in Aristotle's teaching because there's a new challenge politically, and that's the existence of Christianity. And I would say, by the way, all of the scriptural religions, but especially Christianity, because what's his world? Christians. So as you're going to see, what he does in part 3 is he repeats all the core teachings in parts 1 and 2. The only difference is this. In parts 1 and 2, it's his teaching as revealed by nature, science, and reason and observation. What's sometimes called his natural political science or his natural theology. Now, in part 3, he makes all the core arguments about the power of a sovereign to determine what Christian teaching is and everything else, not based on nature, but on Scripture. So part 3 is a remarkable reinterpretation of the Scriptures so as to justify Hobbes' teaching that the sovereign has the power to determine what Christian doctrine is and all other issues within the public sphere. So whereas parts 1 and 2 are based upon reason, observation, science, and nature, part 3 is based upon Scripture, and part 4 is an absolute dismantling of the kingdom of darkness. Darkness is technically the Catholic Church. So that's the Leviathan. Now, just to mention this, when we turn to Locke next week, Locke's political teaching is also contained in 2 parts, because Locke published his great work in 1688, the 2 treatises of government. And if you say there are 2 treatises of government, there's the first treatise and the second treatise. The 2 treatises of government, or Locke, are the exact reversal of Hobbes's parts 1 and 2 and parts 3 and 4. Whereas parts 1 and 2 are the scientific, natural, philosophic foundations of Hobbes' teaching, and part 3 and 4 are the scriptural basis of his teaching, which, by the way, is, if you read part 3 of the Leviathan, all it is, where does the phrase, the devil can quote scripture for his own purpose come from? It's the Merchant of Venice. The devil can cite scripture for his purposes, referring to Shylock the Jew. So Hobbes is using scripture to really recast or reformulate scripture so as to support his teaching. In the first treatise of government, Locke is doing the same thing. The first treatise of government is actually a scriptural foundation of Locke's teaching, and the second treatise of government, which is what we're reading in this class, is the natural and philosophic presentation of Locke's teaching. So, now, any author that writes a book that says, I have the truth, is under an obligation to tell you why he thinks what he says is true. So, if you would please turn to page 105 from chapter 4. Why does Hobbes think that his teaching is true, and what does it mean to say that his teaching is true? Now, by the way, when you're reading a book, don't you want to know if you think it's true, why it's true? Yeah, so this is on page 105, chapter 4. Let's see, let's start with Bree. So obviously, if Hobbes is saying, my book contains the truth, you have to ask the same question that Pontius Pilate does of Jesus. And what was the question he asked? What time is it? No. What was the question? God knows. What's for dinner? What's the philosophic question that Pilate asks of Jesus?
What is true?
What is truth? Hobbes is going to answer that question in these three passages. So if you're looking on page 105 in chapter 4, we're going to come back to chapter 4 in a minute. Seeing then that truth. Now this is important. When an author says, seeing then that truth consisteth of, what's he doing for you right now? He's defining truth. What makes something true? So Bree, seeing that truth consisteth of.
Okay. Seeing then that truth consisteth in the right ordering of names in our affirmations, a man that seeketh precise truth had need to remember what every name he uses stands for, and to place it accordingly, or else he will find himself entangled in words as a bird in lime twigs. The more he struggles, the more belimed. And therefore in geometry, which is the only science that it hath pleased God hitherto to bestow on mankind, men begin at settling the significations of their words, which settling of significations they call definitions, and place them in the beginning of their reckoning.
Now this should remind you of parts 1 and 2 of the Discourse on Method. So is it an exaggeration to say that Descartes and Hobbes think that the mess of human life is essentially caused by sloppy language? Yes. Yes. And by the way, when we come back to chapter 11, so why has human life been so fucked up? It's because people have sloppy thoughts in their heads. So what is science? He actually defines so science is truth. What does science consist of? And remember, do you remember how in part 1 of the Discourse on Method and the 11 sciences that Descartes talks about? And he says, you remember the middle science between the 5 before and the 5 after? The only one that he thought had some element of truth to it was mathematics and geometry. Hobbes is echoing the same idea. So one question you should ask is, why for Descartes and Hobbes is mathematics true? And you're going to see it's true because every concept in math, and if you turn around and look at the board, what I'm going to try to argue is what Hobbes is doing from chapters 13 on, and then in part 2 is he is erecting what I would call not only the new science, the new political science, literally, but also the scientific politics. So, what kind of political ideas did humanity have before? Like what about the Pharaoh? Was the Pharaoh elected?
No.
No.
How did the Pharaoh get to be Pharaoh?
He told everybody he was descended from God.
Yeah. Or was it God? What about Queen Elizabeth II? If you look on her little royal arms, it says underneath, Dieu est mon droit. What does that mean? Dieu. Vous ne parlez pas français? La plume de ma tongue.
I brought that answer, so
Dieu et mon droit is God and my right. Literally, if you've seen the movie, the great movie, The Queen, by the way, Elizabeth believes she rules by grace of what? God. So Hobbes thinks the technical term for those kinds of ideas for Hobbes is bullshit. And you're going to see in chapter 11, he tells you why it's bullshit and why people came to accept it as nonsense. But how many of you had high school geometry? Now, what I've tried to do on the board, in the middle board there, is reproduce in one easy-to-follow diagram all the things you learned in high school geometry.
I don't remember anything I learned in high school geometry.
Well, we can always pray.
I learned how to make a shiv.
Yeah. So, by the way,
Grades, that was like 9 years ago.
so beginning with a point. Now, you could say a point, as in geometry, is actually an assumption or an axiom. You just define as a point in space, right? But, and you're going to see what Hobbes is doing in chapter 13 is clearing away all the detritus of human history and human thought, and starting with human beings as nature really makes them. That's the point. And then you'll see that will morph into chapter 14. Now, what's the definition of a line in geometry?
Anything going continuously
Well, the reason, again, if you follow my diagram, what I want you to see is every subsequent concept is defined precisely in terms of the preceding concept. So what's a line? A series of points. So what's the next reality in geometry after a line? A plane. And what defines a plane in geometry? The intersection of two. And what's a solid figure? An extension of a plane in space. My point here is, when you understand what a solid is, what a plane is, isn't it true that you know exactly what a plane is, or what a solid? Why do you know? Why can you say with absolute certainty what a line, plane, and solid is? Because each of those figures is designed precisely. Now here's the critical thing in terms of scientific consciousness. How many of you have ever had a test in mathematics? How many of you guessed the answer? Now, if you guess the answer, that's technically what Hobbes calls faith.
No, I had very little.
I was about to say, I lost it.
No, but this is absolutely really critical, because you have to see what Hobbes is doing and why he thinks he is the individual that has the key to the human future. If you guessed an answer in a mathematical exam, why did you have to guess it? What are you not capable of doing?
Using the reasoning and logic provided to you to...
In other words, if you really got it, what should you be able to do? Well, answer it, but not by
Say with certainty what the answer
You should be able to work it out on your own.
which means you should be able to show every step of consciousness that goes from point A to point B. So, does that make sense?
Okay, now I understand the geometry reference because of proofs.
That's
You
it.
guys have to do proofs in geometry?
No, but I'm glad you mentioned the proofs. Yeah, so, because the whole point of proof is to have the step by step, and the whole point of that is that every motion of your consciousness, there's no part of it that you don't see. By defining every term in terms of its precedent and measuring everything else, your mind can see every step of the process, right? That is the new politics that Hobbes is going to try to erect in this book. In the case, by the way, dismantling all prior understandings of the source of political authority. So by the time that you finish this book, if Hobbes achieves what he wants, he will be able to show how politics arranges, not from some kind of mythical revelation or some kind of baloney that people tell each other around the campfire, but in the same way that you can do a geometrical proof, you can show where political authority comes step by step. So by the way, in my notes I do this, but on the right side of that is, in chapters 13, Hobbes is, after having cleared away all the crap of human life, Hobbes, in chapter 13, reveals how nature really makes a human being. And by the way, what are the two keys, as you'll see in chapter 13, how nature makes us? Equal and war. The concept that Hobbes is introducing in chapter 13 is the state of nature. Now, the state of nature means the way nature really makes us. Now, by the way, if you look around, look at the people in this class. I know it's disgusting.
Speak for yourself.
I am speaking for myself. How many of you, you know the phrase, it's actually French, au naturel? What does au naturel mean?
All natural.
Yes, and what does it actually mean in English as an expression? Buck naked. Now, I'm not suggesting as a class exercise that we should all become buck naked. Some things just shouldn't be seen by the human eye and imagination. But literally, why do we say naked means au naturel? Are we sitting naturally in that sense right now?
No.
We're wearing these things called fashionable clothes, right?
I'm so glad.
How dare you smirk?
I would not want to put my seat on something where someone's naked butt had been.
And I would also not want to put...
That seems like a perfectly good rule of life.
These chairs like...
My point is
Why would
this.
you do that?
The word nature, I often talk about this in when I'm talking about the Declaration of Independence, or if no matter in English philosophy. The word nature comes from natus, which is a Latin past participle. Natus means born. So what Hobbes claims to do in chapter 13 is to take away all the stuff in human life that's the result of society or artifice, and reveal to you, not strictly speaking, there was one moment in your life when you were au naturel, really naturel, and it has to do with the etymology of the word. And that was when?
When you were born.
Yeah, when you popped out of your mother's womb, or however they got you out of there, and before they slapped the silver nitrate in your eye and smacked you and put you a blue or pink, they don't do that anymore. They don't put a blue or pink thing. But isn't that, but then what, and you're going to see, this is also very Rousseauian. Fine, so you came out of your mother, but what do we immediately do the moment you get out of your mother's womb?
Start crying.
We start shaping you, right?
Oh.
I
Well,
went
no,
for screaming,
we
I was
put
gonna say
clothes
stop
on you.
suffering.
We put clothes on you. We do, isn't it true that the second you come out of your mother's, and by the way, let me explain to you a phrase in Rousseau at the beginning of the social contract. Did you all know, remember every philosopher has an important phrase? I think, therefore I am, blah, 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 blah. Rousseau is, all men are born free, but everywhere they are in chains. Have you ever heard that expression before? He means it. We're born free. But what happens to our freedom the second after we're born? Society starts putting rules, changes. Even, by the way, what's the first artificial thing they do besides slapping you and putting the silver nitrate in your eye and all that stuff? Do they still do that?
No,
I don't think
they
it
don't.
does.
The most artificial thing about you, besides the clothes you're wearing and the computer you're using, is your name.
Oh, yeah, I guess that's good.
So on one level, Hobbes is doing in chapter 13, he's literally taking this point back to the beginning of our birth. And by birth he means, and this is the method that he's using, as we'll see, he's stripping away everything in us that must have come from living in human society. So as you're going to see, what he's trying to do is get you in geometry to the point, so that you can actually see with your own eyes what a human being is by nature. And it isn't pretty. Because it turns out, when you strip away everything that society places on us and puts on us, what do you see? You see an animal. And what's the first thing you know about this animal? One animal is equal to another. So chapter 13 is the great clarion call of modern thought that says nature makes us equal. But here's the other thing nature makes us equal. Icky. Because the state of nature is a state of perfect equality, he says. But it's also, by definition, a state of perfect and absolute war. So, interestingly enough, if you were doing opposites, natural is artificial, right? So what's the state of nature? If the state of nature is the beginning point for Hobbes, what's the opposite that you and I are all in? Society, what he calls the state of civil society. What does that mean, civil society?
This illusion that, laws exist.
Yeah, laws and culture and everything like that, right? So human beings can only exist, it's like water can, water can be three conditions, I guess. Human beings can only exist in two conditions, natural and artificial. What condition are we in right now?
Artificial.
So the question is, if you want to get back to scientific truth, you've got to get back to the way nature made us, and that's what Hobbes claims to do. Then, starting from what nature reveals us to be, the next step up towards politics, a scientific thing, is what's the equivalent of establishing the point? It's the creation of the concept of right in chapter 14. So let me just quickly lay this down. We'll begin with this on Wednesday. So, in the same way that you go from point to line to plane to solid, each step explicit and defined in your own mind, Hobbes is recasting politics as nature makes us. So how do you get scientifically and through precise definition from nature to politics, from the state of nature? One, we have rights, right? Now, when we read in chapter 14, you're going to discover the interesting thing about your my right is how many of you are alive by nature?
Live?
Alive.
Yeah.
Like just
Alive. Isn't that, yeah, and by the way, you're alive because nature made you alive, right? Now, isn't it true, you remember what Hobbes said, the first cosmological principle in the beginning of chapter 1, actually the beginning of chapter 2 is, a thing in motion will always remain in motion unless it stops. Something stops it. Guess what? You are a living piece of matter. And unless something stops your motion, what do you literally, until something stops your motion, called death, you're alive, right? Where did that life come from?
nature.
It came from nature, didn't it? So, the thing is this. Not only are you alive, don't all animals want to stay alive?
Debatable.
So what can an animal do according to the way it's created by nature to stay alive? Whatever it
Not die.
Has to do.
whatever it has to do. So where does the right come from? Where does Hobbes create the idea of right? It turns out that you and I are like little atoms in motion. And in the state of nature, when we're all equal, we're surrounded by an absolutely unlimited sphere of freedom that exists to the entire limits of the universe. So, you and I are all alike, not only are we equal, we're all equally free, because what are we free to do by nature?
Whatever we want.
And that means there are no moral or other kinds of limits except physical to your freedom to stay alive. Out of that, you're going to see Hobbes will derive not only human equality, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness eventually, but ultimately through consent and compact, the creation of the political universe. All right, let's start our
The entirety of them,
No, it still says it's Leviathan by Brenda Saw, so they technically are ISP or whatever. But I think it's 15 pages.
Oh, it was on Zoom.